Um, and I like to try to think that eventually I get to my commitments, but they're not always on schedule. But that's kind of like all software, right? Um, so I'm just by way of background, I lived in Boulder for 25 years. My wife, Amy Bachelor, and I moved here from Boston. Um, I currently am a partner at a venture fund called Foundry Group that's in Boulder. We invest in software internet tech companies all around the US. We also invest about a quarter of our capital in other venture funds. So we've got 32 partner funds that we've invested in. I also co-founded Techstars. So I've been involved in Techstars from the beginning. I'm on the board. My partners and I at Foundry are a large shareholder. I have been an entrepreneur or investor going back to 1987. I started my first company in 87, software consulting business. My partner, also who lives in Boulder, Dave Jilk, some of you may have heard of him, and I wrote all the software for the first couple of years of our business. Dave likes to joke that I'm the best basic programmer he knows. We eventually ended up using a language called Clarion, which was kind of a hybrid between a 4GL and C. I also wrote a lot of software in a language called Dataflex, and this was back when Pascal and C, sort of pre-C++, for people on the phone old enough, these were better versions of DBase or Paradox. I sold that business in '93 to a public company. I became their chief technology officer. They grew very quickly. They got bought by GE Capital a couple of years later. And I started making angel investments. I made about 40 angel investments between 1994 and 1996 with the money I made from selling my first company, and I've been investing ever since. I just got back from a run, so if you see sweat dripping down my face, I can confirm that it is quite hot outside. But I grew up in Texas, so I really like it. My wife, who grew up in Alaska, thinks I'm nuts to go running in 95-degree temperature, but feels good. We don't have kids, so it's just the two of us and two big golden retrievers. I love to run, I love to read, and I like to write. I stopped writing software professionally in 1992 because I was spending all my time running my company. Every couple of years, I learn a new programming language just for fun. I never do much other than, take an online course, buy the introduction to, learn the syntax, play around a little bit. And I found that it was very, very difficult to dip in and have it as an application that way, which is one of the reasons I think I like writing books so much, because in some ways writing a book is very similar to writing software, except the tool chain never changes and the syntax never changes. So, you kind of can do it without having to have a moving target all the time. We live in Boulder, just on the edge of Boulder and Longmont. For those of you that are cyclists, you've probably driven by our house if you've gone down St. Vrain Road. And we also have a place in Alaska where Amy grew up, in Homer, Alaska. And then we generally spend summers in Aspen. We have a house there, but this summer I'm scared of being there. So I've decided we're just going to stay in Boulder all summer. And that's me. That's intro.
Thank you. Super thorough. Appreciate that. For sure. So I'm going to try to run this as a loose moderator. And so the first kind of question comes from Dan. And he kind of wants to know what major trends you're seeing in tech right now, something akin to mobile devices or social media networks that have popped off, anything that you're seeing that's starting to make those little waves that build into big waves as you're watching the industry.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment because of the COVID crisis, there are a number of technologies that have been around for many years, but that did not have ubiquitous adoption, that in a very short period of time, 1 or 2 months, ended up having ubiquitous adoption. And I'll give a few examples. But as part of that, we also had some very dramatic behavior changes across our society. So one example is Zoom and video conferencing. Video conferencing has been around for a long, long time. And the level of quality of video conferencing, frankly, has been around for a while. Zoom is not the paramount of quality. There is some interesting simplicity around it, I think, that has been extremely well executed, and a stability that is extremely well executed. But suddenly, the idea of us interacting this way is second nature. And we're more used to this than most, but 95 or 98% of office workers are now completely comfortable with this kind of technology. Telemedicine would be another example. There has been no telemedicine innovation in the last 3 months, other than the fact that everybody realized that they kind of had to use it. Doctors changed their behavior, hospitals changed their behavior, insurance companies changed their behavior, governments changed their behavior. All of these structural impediments to the adoption of the technology just vaporized. If you had said to someone in January that 95% of office workers would be working from home around the world, they would have laughed at you. And now we have, a large number of tech companies that have said, even Facebook declares, we're going to be a remote first company. Who knows what the fuck that means? Because whatever. But, the number of companies that have shifted their modalities because of the technology and technology infrastructure exists. So as a starting point, I think we have this enormous pent-up amount of existing technology that's been underutilized because of incumbent resistance and structural behavioral resistance. And I think that's gone out the window with the COVID crisis. And so I think we're going to see a lot of opportunity come from that on the technology dimension. I am a believer that the machines have already taken over. I think they took over about a decade ago. And I think they're just very patient. They're letting us put all the data into them. They're just not in a rush. And they're very slowly sort of figuring out how to control us. And we already see it happening, right? I mean, I have a book coming out at the end of the month called The Startup Community Way. And if you're interested in what I talk about, I encourage you to if you want to do me a favor, go on Amazon and pre-order it. Every author loves that. It's a wonderful bonus. But it's a book about, I wrote a book in 2012 about startup communities. And this is a sequel to that book. I based the entire book on the idea of complex systems. And I promise, Dan, that this will come back to answering your question. The whole book is built on the context of complex systems and the idea of a complex system. And emergent behavior is embedded within that. And as software developers, my guess is most of you understand complexity and complex systems. And you understand the difference between a complicated system and the failure of a complicated system, which was the one that was just being described with all the different pieces where you're trying to get something to work a certain way algorithmically and you just couldn't, versus a complex system which doesn't have a deterministic outcome. And in software development, the vast majority of things that we've been working on, except for this universe of either complexity theory, game of life, and emergent programming, emergent viruses, right? Things that are self-modifying. There's sort of a niche part of that in the world of software. Then there's all of this algorithmic programmatic stuff that has a deterministic outcome. And it's very, very complicated, but we are building software that does have a deterministic outcome. All of a sudden, in the last couple of years, we're now living in this world of machine language and artificial intelligence, which are two phrases that mean absolutely nothing, but are used to mean everything. And I went to MIT in the 1980s, and artificial intelligence, and for those of you that are old enough to remember symbolic systems, and Kendall Square Research and companies like this that were very focused on sort of AI and parallel computing, all of a sudden the hardware technology has caught up with a lot of the theories that were being worked on back then, neural networks and stuff like that, that literally the hardware just couldn't do enough with, and we didn't have big enough data sets. Remember this idea that the machines have taken over and they're letting us put the data into them? I'm going to bet most of you know this, but the vast majority of data sets that are used for machine learning have been generated, the very large data sets have been generated by humans, right? Photos is one of the most popular ones. And the reason that there's so many jillions of photos is because we take a bunch of photos that get stored on Google. Google now has this gigantic data set of photos. So we're now in this world where so much of our programming is emergent rather than algorithmic. And we're just, I think, at the precipice of starting to have opportunities in that as the development. And it's not machine learning and AI. I mean, I've been to, a number of, we had a conference at Google here in Boulder where, it was a machine learning AI ethics thing. And there were, I don't know, 40 people in the room and half of them were entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs went around and described what they were doing. And they were all doing AI machine learning stuff, except for every single one of them were basically taking a very large data set, putting it through a procedural system, and trying to come out with an algorithmic outcome. It's not emergent at all. It's not anything to do with any of that stuff. And one or two people were doing things that actually had emergent properties to them. And you could see them sort of like going, eh. And then at the end, we had this very robust conversation about the next wave is where the machines are actually building on themselves rather than us having to put the structure around it. And so I think if you want to sort of move forward and think forward, that's a conceptual frame for it. That's not the, what's the new hot technology? Fuck, I don't know, and I never know, and I'll probably never know. But I think that frame of reference for the next 10 years is going to be one that's very, very rich in the world of software.
Makes sense. Thank you. That was a real deep dive, so it was really interesting. Sort of tangentially related to some of that bigger data is kind of a question from Elise about what your thoughts are on sort of the tech kind of backlash, things that are happening, about App Store, antitrust investigations, privacy violations. There's sort of a larger question about the tech community and what we're all working on. So kind of curious about sort of adverse effects on that with investment as the way you're kind of approaching things, and if you see some antitrust action that may also change investment in tech and big tech.
Yeah, I don't think the investment characteristics are going to change that much. We are as an industry way overdue for a tech backlash, and I think the arrogance of I'm just going to be generalized about it versus specific. The arrogance of the technology industry has sort of tipped too far on one end, right? The Bay Area progressive society of we're going to fix the world. We know what's good for you world. We're building things that are good for you. Do no evil. Enable the entire world to communicate. Like the platitudes that have come out of the large tech companies that are in some ways very nice ideals, but that have not been instantiated in reality. And a lot of the reason they haven't been instantiated in reality is that as these companies have become very, very large, very successful, shareholder-driven businesses, even if they have very deep value systems or they think they have very deep value systems, it's very hard, again, in the evolution of something like this to control that. And I think we have had this significant amount of, I would almost say inappropriate self-reflection. Like again, I'm being very generalized and I'm saying we, not to try to encompass this group of people, but we, the tech industry. When you're telling the world that you know how to fix them, that's a pretty rough position to be in if you actually then end up doing things that don't fix them. And it's also a pretty rough position to be in if you end up doing things that don't fix them and then you say, no, not my fault. That's not what I was trying to do. I'm not responsible for that. And that's a lot of the posture that's been playing out. And, it's not just one big social networking company that behaves that way, but a whole lot of people, including a lot of people who have generated a lot of wealth and a lot of power. And are not necessarily thinking about anymore the concept of how their behavior and how their company's behavior interact with society as a whole. The other side of it, by the way, is Phil Weiser, who is now our Attorney General. Yeah, I love that from Dan Moore. That's exactly right. Now that I'm rich, fuck you. I mean, literally, that's kind of a little bit of. Unfortunately, not everybody, but unfortunately, some of the shtick. Phil Weiser, who's now our Attorney General, when he was Dean of CU Law School, he and I are longtime very good friends, and I've learned a lot from Phil. Phil made a statement. He says the law does not keep up with technology, and it is a fundamental problem in society because the law, government, is constantly trying to figure out what to do and how to create the structures and the norms. And government is influenced by power, and yet technology moves so quickly that government can't like it can't do anything around it. And all it can do is be responsive to the things that it knows how to react to, which oftentimes are incumbents, large companies, people who have a lot of power, people who have a lot of money. And so we're in this weird place where we have incredible structural inequities in our society, at least in our country, I think around the world, but certainly in the United States. And in some ways, technology has accelerated the structural inequities that we have versus the idealization of bringing people together and making everybody's lives better. And when we find ourselves in that position as a society, I think there's a lot of stress. And we have that stress plus a whole bunch of other stresses at the same time, right? We have COVID, we have the health stress, we have economic stress, we have racial inequity as a stress point, we have mental health as a stress point. And the combination of all of these things is a brilliant opportunity for technology to be a force of good. But it's also a challenge because it means that incumbent behaviors are going to have to shift and change. And by the way, the neat thing about the technology industry is that we have endless disruption of all the industries and all the companies. It's kind of probably got the most disruption of anything. But if you think about the very, very large incumbent, powerful companies today, they don't really want to be that disrupted. And so there's a lot of interesting challenges around those things. I don't have the answers to any of it. I just know that as a participant in, again, I'll use the phrase complex system, a very complex system, my little bits of behavior probably have lots of impact downstream that I have no understanding of. And I think that's true for everybody, right? So whatever you're doing, even if it's a small effect, it probably has an amplified effect downstream somewhere else. And so it's worth thinking about lining up your actions and your words and your value systems against the backdrop of what's going on.
It's great. And that kind of dovetails with our ethics and programming kind of lightning talk we had before. So that was a really interesting kind of train of thought that you had there. Thank you. And sort of dovetails off of that is kind of based on that sort of techlash and things. What are you kind of investing in, if you can speak to it, of course, that you're excited about? And is it only in technology? Is it outside of that? Are you trying to push things forward, as you just sort of mentioned, with your investments towards those sort of maybe making things better? Not to put you on the spot in that way. But.
No, I'm fine. Well, in used I'm going to separate me from Foundry Group. Even though I'm a partner of Foundry Group, because they're different, right? I mean, if you ask me what Brad Feld, am interested in this moment, of course, I have a venture firm that I'm part of, so we're interested in something, but I'm a piece of that versus that. I'm gonna answer the question from my frame of reference rather than as Foundry. So I'm gonna be specific there. I'm actually not that interested in anything from a technology perspective. And at the same time, I'm interested in a lot of things. So I'm not really focused on the next thing and chasing the next thing as an investor. I have a large portfolio. I have a number of companies that I've invested in that are doing things on the intersection of what 10 years ago was probably called atoms and bits or makers. For me, it's the idea of the consumerization of industrial products. So desktop 3D printing, company in Seattle called Glowforge that makes a 3D laser cutter, desktop 3D laser cutter, a company in Brooklyn called Looking Glass that makes a holographic display, 3D holographic display. Like, I'm interested in that kind of stuff because I really, again, believe in this intersection between humans and machines, and I'm fascinated with it. However, I'm 54, and here's an interesting thing that happens as you get older. I think as you get older, you become less relevant as an early stage investor. And so in a lot of ways, what I've shifted my energy towards is being, I have a lot of experience building and growing companies and a lot of experience through both successes and failures. So spending a lot of time helping on that vector and spending a lot of time helping with the next generation of investors. And so in some ways, that's becoming more interesting to me because it's very, very hard to stay in the mix. If I was 20 years younger, I would have been very, very deep into blockchain. When blockchain came around, and when the emergence of it started and crypto started as a technology, not as a speculative thing, I had some interest in it, and I realized that to really engage in it, the energy level and the investment that I had to put into it was so great that I'd be better off supporting some people that were putting that energy level and investment into it at that dimension. So for me, a lot of the stuff that I've started to become interested in around technology is maybe the broader socioeconomic impacts of technology to our society and to our planet, not in a save the world kind of way, but in the intricacy of how this evolution very rapidly of technology is changing the way that we as humans interact with each other. And so a theme that I've for a long time invested in, which I refer to as human-computer interaction, but the interaction between humans and machines, continues to be the thing that is most fascinating to me. And I'll just end with one example. I traveled for 25 years, I traveled 75% of the time. I never have to get on an airplane again in my life. I never have to go anywhere again. I don't have the desire to go to a place, especially now. But, you know, at some point in the future when people go places again, I don't want to. I am thrilled. I've never liked to work in an office that much. We have a nice office downtown. You know, even when I'm in town, I only go to it about 25% of the time. I work at home a lot. Very comfortable doing that. All of a sudden, our society, which viewed me as an exception, right? I was an edge case. I was a weirdness in that. I didn't fit into the dynamic of how the work flowed. And so in some ways, either I was odd or I was having to compromise what I wanted to do to interact with the work flow that was happening in a different way. All of a sudden, that's out the window. And I think over the next 20 years, so many of the norms of our society will be thrown out the window because of the desires of what we want as humans and the things that technology enables us to be able to do that 20 years ago we couldn't. And so I'm super interested in that kind of stuff.
Fascinating. Thanks for answering that. I have a question actually from Ryan Cook, and feel free to interject if you just got to go at any point. We don't
No, I'm good. I got my run in before we talked, so I don't time out at 7:30.
Okay, perfect. So this sort of, you touched on it briefly, sort of that the coins and Bitcoin kind of situations, and I'm not very up on that thing. I would consider myself missed that boat. And it sounds like you've sort of enabled people who have the energy to do that. But how does it kind of, how are you seeing that sort of coin and token craze in the industry today, VC wise and such? Have you seen like drastic changes, still kind of slow burning?
There's two different things that are super important to recognize when you talk about blockchain or crypto, is that they're totally separate phenomena, right? Blockchain is a protocol, it's a technology protocol. It's clever, but it's not profound. To implement it at scale for different applications is quite hard. But in some ways, as a technology protocol, it's as foundational as HTTP is. And in hindsight, of course, HTTP is not that remarkable, but it's quite remarkable, right? Like it's both things. Like the essence of it's not that complicated to understand, but the implications of what you can do with it, and then what's been built as a result of the protocol is incredible. SMTP is the same way. Like, you know, email, really? We're still fucking talking about email, and it's 2020. And, you know, we were investors in SendGrid. I remember when we invested early in SendGrid in 2010, everybody's like, what, another email investment? How could you ever make, email's dead. How could you ever make money on email, right? And so the protocol level of blockchain is that. On the crypto side of it, what happened was this idea of applying this kind of technology to a very speculative alternative to using money as a value store. And there's a whole bunch of philosophical things in that, including a whole bunch of libertarianism and a whole bunch of anarchism and decentralization and that sort of thing. Fundamentally, much of that is just pure and raw speculative activity, right? People literally not using it for a productive energy, just trading it, speculating on the price going up, the price going down, the same way you'd speculate on a stock price going up, price going down. The blockchain piece of all of that is incredibly interesting because of how that enables completely decentralized, uncontrolled, non-controlled implementation of systems, right? There's not a boss, there's not a controller, there's not a leader, there's not a centralized data store, there's not somebody that owns the thing. That I find important, and I think that'll be very durable over a long period of time. The crypto side of it, I have no idea whether that's anything more interesting than a speculative tradable object. Dan says Dutch tulips, like that's probably the far cynical view of it, and it could be completely correct, but it's not that interesting to me. And I think from a purely sort of software perspective and a technology perspective, that's not interesting. If you're interested in trying to get rich and make a lot of money, you can be a day trader or you can trade cryptocurrencies, and you'll probably lose all your money, but you might get lucky, right? And it's probably a little bit more intellectually stimulating than playing the lottery, but it's the same kind of thing. You're not really doing anything productive. The other side of that equation, I think you're doing a lot of things very productive.
Yeah, that's a good summation. Thanks for taking my awkward question and running with it. That was great. Okay, I have about 2 or 3 more to throw at you if it will work. And so Eric Dobbs had asked, a few years ago, he was trying to get a job around educational technology. At the time, he couldn't find anyone that could afford to pay software developers salaries. So you sort of touched on this already. Has COVID and the surge of educational institutions sort of trending towards online learning changed how VCs are investing in educational technology, online collaboration? Are you seeing some shifts there?
Yeah, ed tech for many years was very fallow ground for investing. There were only a few ed tech related companies that had been successful over the years, and those companies themselves, their products were kind of shitty. Blackbaud was a company some people may know of. There are a few others, but it was just not a very inspiring segment, even though there have been people working on ed tech for a long time, and some issues around how you deal with it structurally because of the way that public education, private education works. Some of it the funding, and some of it just the sclerotic nature of education broadly writ. About 5 years ago, I think that started changing, and there are actually a handful of venture funds that are ed tech focused that have been quite successful. There's been an emergence of companies that are, I would say, software companies that shifted from being classroom-based things to various types of hybrid learning environments. It could be at the home, it could be distributed learning, it could be in the classroom. And some of them were things like online courseware like Coursera, and Udemy. Some of it was things that were more educational versions of Minecraft. I don't know if anybody knows Roblox, but it's an incredibly successful company that's basically built on that. A number of other companies emerged that were sort of at the intersection of education and entertainment, and teaching kids how to code by using or teaching them STEM-related activities by using computers, all of that being woven into the educational infrastructure, in addition to just infrastructure for managing distance learning, managing classroom-based activity, et cetera. Techstars actually had an accelerator for a couple of years with Kaplan Learning, and they had 2 years, I think they did that one, and they had about 20 companies that came through it, and you could sort of see good innovations coming. Then you also have, a local company that we're investors in for a long time, Sphero, who I expect many of you know, is 100% focused on education at this point. Their products, it's a sizable business. They have good, steady growth, and if you take a Sphero, you can certainly buy it for entertainment, but the real sort of content and value around what they've done now is all of the educational activity that can be done again in classroom or at home. And if you look at their product roadmap, it's going down that path. So I think that momentum was building already. And again, COVID just went boom, right? You have 3 months, everybody's at home and homeschooled, and you all of a sudden realize how grossly inadequate all of the stuff is for that. I don't have kids. My brother has a teenager who's in 10th grade, I think, just finished 10th grade. She was done with school at 12 every day. She's a very smart kid, right? She when she'd go to school, she'd stay up till 11 o'clock doing her homework. I mean, she was done by noon every day, like done, because that's the level of ability that the infrastructure had. My wife's on the board of Wellesley College. And they've done a good job of being, offering distributed learning for their students, but it was an unsatisfying experience relative to the sort of in-person on-campus experience. Not because the in-person on-campus experience was necessarily so much more awesome. Obviously, elements of it were much better, but the inadequacy of the remote learning environment and all of the activity around that. So I think there will be a big wave of that. I don't believe everybody's just going to go back to school in the fall and it's going to be normal. So I think the near-term opportunities for that kind of innovation is high. And unlike, for example, telemedicine, where the software and infrastructure had been in place for a long time, I think in the world of ed tech, it was grossly missing. We also have a huge inequity problem, and it's worth noting this, especially for Colorado. In Colorado, we have about 50,000 households, so not people, but households, that don't have high-speed internet, don't have access to it. We also have about 50,000 households, not the same ones, some overlap, that don't have a computer. And these are households with kids, sorry, I should qualify. It's about 1.5 million households in Colorado. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's households with kids, right? So you've got a large number of households with kids that literally can't do distance learning. Oh, if you got 4 kids in your house and you got 1 computer, you're kind of screwed too. And so the social inequity of this and the wealth gap, which we have, is just exacerbated now. And there's a compounding educational effect. If you're a kid in a household with a single mom, who's not able to work because of her, or has an essential job and has to go out each day to go to work, and the 4 of you are sitting around with 1 computer, and you lose a year of education. Pretty rough. It's a totally solvable problem, but it takes some real motivation by the part of our society to solve that problem. And so it's not just that the technologies don't exist in a lot of cases, but the social inequities and the economic inequities cause people to not have the access that they would need to be able to participate this way. And I think it's something to be tuned into, for better or for worse, the way the United States works. Like, that's something that's going to get solved at a state-by-state level. I don't think we have done a particularly good job in Colorado of that. We're fortunate that we have a governor in Jared who cares deeply about education and equity. So hopefully, coming out of this, there will be some real focus and attention on that. But that's another part of the problem.
Well said. And I think a lot of us are happy to have Jared up there, kind of going to bat for these sorts of things. Okay, I think about a couple more questions. Still doing good on time on your end?
Yeah, let's do 2 more.
Okay, perfect.
Because I gotta go study my Python book.
Nice. This is a Ruby meetup, just to be clear. Okay.
Wrong one. Damn it! I close.
Close enough. We'll take it. It's related. So Pavel asks, do you expect the big guys like Facebook or Amazon to be broken up, and do you think they should be broken up? And this is sort of a risky question maybe to answer, but it was asked, so I wanted to pass it on.
No, I don't think they will be broken up, and no, I don't think they should be broken up. I don't think that's the dynamic. I think that there's plenty of other things that can be done. And by the way, Amazon and Facebook are totally different companies and they have totally different issues. So it's worth saying that. Unfortunately, I think the government, from a top-down perspective, tends to have a hard time getting the nuance of that. And the discussion tends to miss the nuance of that. I was around, and I was investing. I was no longer running my first company, but I was investing in the late 90s when the government antitrust suit with Microsoft happened, and Microsoft was almost broken up and divided into 2 companies, the OS business and the apps business. And I thought at the time that would have been a huge mistake, and in retrospect, I continue to believe it would have been a huge mistake. I think the character of the companies matters over a long period of time. And how the character develops and evolves also matters. And in the case of a company like, I'll just express my own opinion. I feel like Amazon as a company, while they have plenty of flaws and plenty of issues, because every company does, I think they have a very clear character. They have a good understanding as a business of what they are. And they have I don't want to use the word moral fiber as the word because it's too judgmental and it's too easy to debate, but like they have a clear center that is effective across the whole organization. Facebook, my view of it is it's oriented around one person. By the way, I don't believe that Amazon's center is based around Bezos. I believe that he has heavy influence over it, but it's not around him. Facebook, it's around one person. And that person's value system has a lot of ambiguity in it. And that ambiguity is problematic. It wouldn't be problematic if there was no ambiguity. Right? If the person said, nope, this is what I believe and this is how it works and this is what it is. Okay, yeah, I got to live with that. But, there's having had long history in different places, both as a competitor in some cases, a partner in some cases, a customer in other cases of Facebook, there's an enormous amount of ambiguity about what the company's trying to accomplish and how it's trying to accomplish that makes, I think, me very uncomfortable. I think that came to fore in 2016 around the election and has emerged subsequently. And the amount of lies and obfuscations, that are now well documented, but as an insider, were easy to know. And if anybody's sort of curious about it, there's a really good book written by Roger McNamee called Zucked. And McNamee was an investor in Facebook. He's very famous in the Bay Area. And he wrote a very aggressive book that sort of unfolded the struggle post-election. He's very liberal. Unfolded the struggle post-election with what I would probably say is his view of Facebook's moral ambiguity and Zuckerberg and the leadership's team's moral ambiguity around what happened. And look, if you screw up, you own it. Hey, this happened. We screwed up. I own it. It's not. I don't think it's okay when you screw up to say, no, we didn't do that, or we didn't know about that, or that really wasn't us, or no, don't look over there, or squirrel, right? Like there's too much of that action going on in the context of that company. And I don't put Amazon in the same category there. And Amazon has different issues, but that's a problem that I think is deep. By the way, I think, at Google, the leadership shift at Google, I think is very helpful, because it gets rid of some of that moral ambiguity that was that existed, not because of any, I think, determined behavior, but sort of the strange detachment that the leadership of Google and Alphabet through, when Larry Page was CEO, existed around that. And I think, that ambiguity is it takes a while to unroll that, but it's unrolling. Microsoft doesn't have any moral ambiguity, and they haven't for a while. And Microsoft screws up lots of things, and they do lots of things that are rough competitively, and they make lots of mistakes as a business. That's different. And so, sort of that cast of characters, there's really only one of those companies that I personally feel incredibly uncomfortable with. But even then, I don't think they should be broken up. I don't know what that means. I think that there should be a lot more scrutiny paid and a lot more responsibility taken for their actions and their involvement in things.
And I think that's a good way to put it. Maybe it's not broken up, but it's should there be more oversight and responsibility? Exactly. So,
and look, the market is part of it. Like, there's the current advertising boycott. Some directed at Facebook, some directed at social media in advance of the election. Will that have an impact? I mean, I read one article where somebody says, it's only 2% of their revenue. They're not going to give a shit. Well, maybe, but if it's 10% of their revenue and then it extends for another month, and there's enough people saying, hey, this sucks, maybe people will start to pay attention. I don't know. But that's for us as individuals to impact. And again, the small things have a long downstream ripple effect.
Sure. Thank you. This one hopefully will be a quick one, and then it is 2 more questions, but the last one is more of a what you're working on kind of question.
Yep.
So Ryan Cook wanted to know, have any companies used Colorado's investor-ready co-ops, limited cooperative associations to raise VC that you're aware of?
I am not aware of that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have any insight into that.
Fair enough. I figured it might be a quick question because I'd never even heard of it. So yeah, the final kind of question here is, sort of browsing your Twitter feed, and I've tried to follow up to sort of tie this in. Are you doing anything? I've seen some things mentioned, and know that you're doing things around mental health and social good and community related help, especially with COVID, but overall, that seems to be one of your focuses. Could you sort of talk to what you're doing in that more personal sense around making our community better? And then what are you kind of working on that you would like to kind of tell us about? I mean, there's the book. What else is Brad Feld up to that he wants to tell us about?
Yeah, so I've only left my house 3 times since March 11th. Each time, twice to go to the doctor for Amy, once to go to the doctor for me. And I don't expect that I'll leave my house till 2021. I was very involved for about 75 days, probably about half my time in state-related activity around COVID, both on the health side and the economic side. I spun up 2 startups, each with one with about 100 people, the other with now has about 250 people in it that are both nonprofits. One called Innovation Response Volunteers that helped with a bunch of health and data related things. It included a team that Tim Miller led, and he continues to lead, called Citizen Software Engineers, which Tim was the CEO of Rally for many years. And we got a group of about 100 people together that have done a bunch of data and analysis tools for the state at the very front end of the COVID crisis to help them be able to organize and categorize a bunch of the data that the state didn't have the resources to be able to focus on, especially in the midst of the crisis. I was also involved on an economic team that rolled up to OEdit and Betsy Markey. And I focused on businesses that were under 500 people across the state of Colorado. And as part of that, the government side thing was a recommendation body. I created a nonprofit called Energize Colorado. If you go to energizecolorado.com, you'll see it. And Wendy Lee, who's an entrepreneur that's based in Boulder, is the CEO. And we've got about 200 something active volunteers working on that nonprofit, helping businesses across the state of Colorado that are less than 500 people deal with the stabilization phase of the crisis, but also the recovery and growth phase coming out of it. So I had a lot of intense focus on that in the last couple of months, in addition to lots of work on my portfolio at Foundry because of all the companies that we had that for the first 30 days, we were all trying to figure out, who's going to be okay and who's not going to be okay and what do we need to do. Yep, that's Citizen Software Engineers. The other one is Energize Colorado. And I think, I can't remember if it's .com or .org off the top of my head. Just Energize Colorado will get you there. So a lot of time on my existing portfolio and other stuff in the Foundry portfolio. We had a handful of companies that I would put in the near-term fucked category, which could also be politically correctly set as the red category. If you're dependent on people traveling or people going to work, you had a lot of short-term stress. And so sort of figuring out what to do. We also had companies that benefited from the COVID crisis. And we had some companies, a local company like Jump Cloud that some of you may know, that actually probably on the margin benefit a little bit because of the work from home trends. And were, fast growing companies already and just continue to be fast growing companies. So it's getting a handle on all that stuff from a work perspective was challenging. I'm very much on the other side of that. In the COVID crisis, what I realized was there was initially at the end of March, I wrote a post called The 3 Crises on my blog. And I described the COVID crisis as a health crisis, which was unprecedented in our lifetime. The closest I'd ever experienced to it was HIV/AIDS when I was in college. And that was a incredibly scary, very mysterious disease, but that it was slow moving. But there was a huge amount of stigma around it and lots of challenges around it. But that was the closest thing to the COVID pandemic. This is global. This is fast moving. This is an enormous amount of political nonsense in the midst of the health crisis that just makes understanding and dealing with the health crisis that much harder. That triggered an economic crisis. Our economy was doing just fine in January, February. We had lots of, economic inequity in our country and in the world, but the macro economy was in quite good shape. So we triggered an economic crisis. That's triggered a mental health crisis. We're not used to being in our houses 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I happen to like it. I'm very fortunate that I don't have kids, I have a big house, and I have a wife, and I've got plenty of resources. But there's lots of people that don't have that or don't like being cooped up in their house because of what they naturally like. And so the challenges in our society around that, independent of the stresses of the first two, have created a mental health crisis that is, I think, more pervasive than anything we've dealt with, certainly in my lifetime, especially against the backdrop of people having more awareness and less stigma around mental health as an issue. And then, of course, with the George Floyd murder, that triggered a racial inequity crisis. That's not new. We've had one in the US for 450 years. But the intensity of it is just another, again, complex system sort of intersecting with these other complex systems in this moment of time. Personally, I've always spent a lot of energy on destigmatizing mental health. That's been something I've been working on since I was very public about a depressive episode that I had in 2013. I've also been very involved in getting more girls and women involved in computer science and eliminating gender inequity. And I use the word eliminating gender inequity in technology. I've been involved, I was the founding board chair of an organization called National Center for Women in Information Technology, Boulder-based, ncwit.org. Lucy Sanders runs it. I've learned more from Lucy about gender equity than anybody else. And one of the things I learned, I started working with her in 2005, I learned in the first year that virtually everything I knew about gender equity was wrong. Everything that men said about the problem was at best neutral and generally harmful. All of the anecdotal things about it, again, at best neutral, generally harmful. And I was able to very quickly settle into a role where I was what today we would call an advocate or an ally, where I was listening, learning, and supporting Lucy and other women in this process of change, versus being the one that was directing what the change should be. And since the George Floyd murder, I've taken the same exact approach with racial equity. Amy and I have been contributing through our foundation, which is called the Anchor Point Foundation. For 20 years, we've been contributing to social justice causes. And so we feel good about ourselves for contributing to social justice causes. But when I sat down and wrote down the list of my close friends who were Black, it was less than 10 people. I didn't feel good about that when I actually sat down and did that. And when I started to think about the lived experience of racial inequity, I realized that pretty much everything I thought was likely wrong. And I mapped it back to that same experience I had with gender equity in 2005. And so in terms of what I'm spending some time on now, I reached out to all my friends who were Black, and I also got introduced or asked for introduction to a few other people that I knew of and that I thought I could learn from, both men and women. And instead of asking them, what can I do? What I said is, what are two things that you're working on that I can support with time, money, or influence? I want to support you and the things you're working on, and I want to get involved, and that's how I'm going to learn about what's going on, and that's how I'm going to learn how to be helpful. And I'm, 2 months into that, and it's been powerful because, my own hypothesis of it's similar to my journey with gender equity. I don't know anything, and most of the things that I know are wrong is correct. Whether they're conscious or unconscious bias or irrelevant. And the idea that I can show up as a middle-aged white guy with resources and say, okay, I know how to fix the problem is complete nonsense. But that me showing up as a middle-aged white guy with resources and saying, all right, I want to help you on the things that you are doing, that's a powerful thing. So that's been a meaningful piece of my energy. I do have this book coming out at the end of the month, Startup Community Way. It's been 3 years in the making. The book that I wrote in 2012, Startup Communities, I don't know if any of y'all have read it, but I use Boulder as the story for building the construct for building a startup community anywhere in the world. The phrase startup community didn't exist, now it does. The idea that you can build startup communities anywhere in the world is something that's well understood and believed, and that book had a huge influence on it. I'm hopeful that this book will have huge influence on the way that we think about solving problems, and shifts us into this idea around complex systems. It's completely accidental that the book is coming out in the middle of one of the most significant lived experience I'm having around the intersection of multiple complex systems. And we knew the book would be generalizable. We didn't just write it about startup communities. We wrote it about complex systems, but we used startup communities as the wrapper. But I think it's generally applicable for anyone who is trying to think about creating change over a long period of time or being involved over a long period of time in something that they care a lot about. So that's, I put a lot of energy into that. I've also created, to the extent that you're interested, something I'm calling the Startup Community. One of the problems or things that I've been hoping for since I wrote the Startup Communities book is somebody would create an online virtual startup community, and nobody has. I don't know why. And so I just put one up as an experiment about 10 days ago, and it's growing like crazy. It's probably about 2,000 people in it already. I haven't broadcasted very broadly, and it's completely bottoms up and organic. So I'm not trying to control it. People are inviting whoever they want. It's self-organizing into different groups. I'm using a tool called Mighty Networks for it, which is remarkably good for something like this. Sort of has all the right kinds of pieces that you'd want, but doesn't have a bunch of the cruft that you'd have if you were trying to do something like this in, for example, Facebook. And while it has some limitations, it's been really impressive how good it is, and somebody's got the link to it there. So please join if you want and jump in. What else am I involved in? I decided I'm going to run a COVID marathon. So my house here, I've got right around 40 acres. I built a running path on the edge of my property many years ago because I like to run with my dogs, and I run 3 or 4 miles with them. It's a 0.95 loop, just under a mile. And so I'm going to run a marathon, which is 27 loops at the end of September. I'm a big runner, and we'll see how that goes. Like I did eight the other day, and it wasn't mind-numbing. Lots of people say, geez, 27 loops of the same thing. But I love to run, and I love being on my land, and it's a good physical distraction in this moment that's otherwise stressful. So that's me. I'm easy to get access to. I know a few of you. I don't know all of you, but brad@feld.com is my email. I would put myself in the category of I try to respond to everything, and if I can be helpful to you, I'm happy to try. I'm very good at saying no. I'm very good at saying I don't know something. But I'm also, my view is I have a deep philosophy. Some of you may have heard it's now a hashtag. Techstars turned my philosophy into a hashtag, so that's pretty awesome. It's hashtag give first, and I'll just define it as the ending point. It came from my first book, a phrase I used in the book called give before you get, and somebody at Techstars realized that give first was a better hashtag than hashtag give before you get. It's the idea of putting energy into something without knowing what you're going to get back from it. It's not altruism. You expect to get something back, but you don't know from whom, when, over what period of time, in what magnitude, and in what consideration. And if you can get enough people in a community to behave that way, to give first, you build this very strong positive feedback loop. If you know anything about complex systems, positive feedback loops, a positive contagion are super important things. All of a sudden, lots of stuff starts to happen, and then lots of benefit starts to accrue to the people that are participating. And I kind of live my life that way to the extent that I can, and I'd offer myself up to you and y'all in that regard. I have no idea what would come back from me being helpful to you. I think today's talk is an example of that. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully it's something that's interesting and you got a couple of nuggets out of it. But view me as someone that's part of your network. And my only request is remind me where you came, where I met you, right? Hey, Brad, you talked at our Boulder Ruby event. You thought it was the Boulder Python event, but it's actually the Boulder Ruby event. And then start with the punchline. Here's the thing you want me to focus on. If it's a question, ask the question. If it's a thing you're looking for help on, start with that. And then as much more as you want is fine. But that way I'm focused versus I have to wade through a bunch of stuff to get to the point. That's my only request.
It's amazing. And I think the give first sort of thing that you've kind of come up with and Techstars hashtagged for you is really essential in Boulder. And I found a lot of value in following that mantra and witnessing other people do it. So thanks for putting that out there. I think it's amazing.
Thanks.
And I think that's about it. We've taken a lot of your time and received a bunch of insights. So we super appreciate your time and energy here and out there in the world. So we do appreciate everything.
Thanks, y'all, and I'll see you online since at least until the end of 2020.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.